Number 1. Siege Ladder Assault Troop. Storming castle walls with ladders was one of the deadliest jobs in ancient warfare. These soldiers were the first to charge, fully exposed to arrows, boiling oil, rocks, and anything else defenders could throw down. Climbing up a shaky ladder under fire meant almost certain death. Most never made it to the top. They were often poorly equipped and considered expendable, sent in first to absorb casualties and test the defences. In short, human cannon fodder with a life expectancy of minutes. Number 2. Flag Bearer. Carrying the flag into battle might sound honourable, but it was one of the most dangerous and thankless roles on the battlefield. The standard bearer's job was to hold the army's colours high so troops could see where to rally. But that visibility came at a deadly price. Flag bearers were obvious targets. Enemy archers, musketeers, and even cavalry aimed for them first to break unit cohesion and morale. Often unarmed or lightly armed, they couldn't defend themselves properly. Worse, dropping the flag was seen as disgraceful. Even in mortal danger, they were expected to hold it high or die trying. They couldn't take cover, retreat, or fight back effectively. They had to march straight into chaos while remaining upright and visible. In many battles, multiple flag bearers died in quick succession, one after another. Honour aside, the role often meant being the first to fall, for the sake of a symbol. Number 3. Roman Decimation Survivor. In the Roman army, decimation was a brutal punishment for cowardice or mutiny. When a unit was found guilty, every 10th man was selected, often by drawing lots, and executed by their own comrades. But surviving decimation could be even worse than dying in it. The psychological trauma was immense. You had just helped kill fellow soldiers, friends, tent mates under orders. Trust within the unit shattered instantly. Survivors were marked, humiliated, and often reassigned to the most dangerous duties imaginable: clearing enemy defences, walking into ambush zones, or leading suicide charges. There was no honour in survival, only shame and suspicion. Officers no longer trusted you, and fellow soldiers resented or feared you. Decimation was meant to discipline through terror, and it worked. For those left alive, it meant living with guilt, constant danger, and no way to regain dignity. In the Roman ranks, surviving decimation meant living as the walking dead. Number 4. Field Musketeer Loader. In early modern warfare, muskets were slow, awkward, and unreliable. As a field musketeer, especially one tasked with reloading, you were stuck in a terrifying cycle: shoot once, then stand still and reload for 20 to 30 seconds. All while enemy volleys tore through the battlefield. Reloading wasn't simple. It involved multiple steps: biting open a powder cartridge, pouring it down the barrel, ramming the ball, priming the pan, all done in open view, with no cover. Musketeers stood shoulder to shoulder, and the smoke from dozens of guns quickly turned battlefields into choking, blinding hellscapes. Worse still, accuracy was poor, and many died before even getting a second shot off. Artillery ripped through tight ranks, and cavalry charged before reloading could finish. Musketeers were often peasants with minimal training, just bodies to fill the lines. As a loader, you weren't just exposed. You were slow, vulnerable, and essentially waiting to die between shots. Number 5. Peasant Conscript in the French Revolutionary Armies. When revolutionary France went to war in the 1790s, it needed massive armies fast. The solution: mass conscription of peasants, men with no military experience ripped from farms and villages and shoved into uniform with minimal training. These conscripts were often handed outdated weapons, sometimes with no bayonets or enough powder. In many cases, they were issued pikes instead of muskets. Training was rushed or non-existent. Many had never marched in formation, let alone fired in combat, yet they were sent into battle against disciplined, professional armies from Austria, Prussia, and Britain. The revolutionary armies favoured mass attacks and sheer numbers over tactics. As a result, these men were thrown into frontal assaults, charging straight into cannon fire, musket lines, and cavalry. Officers were often political appointees rather than professionals, adding to the chaos. Communication on the battlefield was poor, and fear spread easily. For peasant conscripts, war meant confusion, hunger and death in muddy fields far from home. They were not expected to survive, only to weaken the enemy for the next wave. Used as expendable masses rather than soldiers, their role was less about victory and more about endurance through slaughter. Number 6. Trench runner. In the chaos of World War I, battlefield communication was primitive. Radios were unreliable, phone lines were often destroyed by shell fire, and so armies relied heavily on trench runners, soldiers tasked with carrying written messages by foot between trenches, command posts, and frontline units. It was one of the most dangerous jobs on the Western Front. Runners had to leave the relative safety of their own trenches and cross exposed ground, sometimes even through no man's land, dodging artillery, snipers, machine guns, and gas attacks. The terrain was hellish. Mud, barbed wire, corpses and craters everywhere. Getting lost or caught in crossfire was common. Trench runners worked alone and often with incomplete maps or directions. If they were killed or captured, vital information never reached its destination. There was immense pressure. Lives depended on them, yet they had no real protection and little support. Despite the risk, runners had to move quickly and remain calm under fire. Some never made it past their first mission. Others ran dozens of times a day through zones where every step could be their last. In a war defined by senseless ESS slaughter, trench runners lived and died in the deadliest margins. Number 7. Tunnel digger. One of the most horrifying and claustrophobic roles in World War I was that of the tunnel digger, also known as a military miner. These soldiers were tasked with digging narrow tunnels beneath no man's land, often directly under enemy trenches, to plant massive explosives. The work was done in near total darkness, deep underground, with only candles or weak lamps for light. The tunnels were cramped, barely wide enough to crawl through, and constantly at risk of collapsing. Oxygen was scarce, the air was stale, and gas pockets could suffocate or poison entire teams. But the worst threat came from enemy diggers. Both sides used listening devices to detect underground movement. When opposing teams met, brutal hand-to-hand combat followed, fought silently in pitch blackness with knives, shovels, or fists. It was warfare at its most primal and terrifying. The constant fear of being buried alive or blown up without warning never left these men. There was no glory, no daylight, and no escape route. Their work shaped some of the biggest blasts of the war. But most tunnel diggers lived in complete isolation, knowing they could vanish beneath the earth at any moment. Number 8. Gas Sentinel. During World War I, poison gas became one of the most feared weapons on the battlefield. To defend against surprise attacks, armies assigned gas sentinels, soldiers whose sole job was to detect incoming gas and sound the alarm for their unit. It was a role that demanded constant vigilance, day and night, in the filth and stench of the trenches. Gas was often invisible or hard to see, especially in low light or fog. Sentinels had to rely on smell or subtle changes in the air, sometimes too late. A single, delayed warning could doom an entire company. These soldiers were often the first exposed. Wind shifts, nighttime raids, or defective masks meant many died before they could alert others. Even when they survived, long-term exposure to low doses caused severe lung damage, blindness, or chronic illness. The psychological toll was immense. Sentinels lived in a constant state of anxiety, knowing that their failure, even by seconds, meant the agonizing death of friends and comrades. There was no room for rest, no margin for error, and no real protection. In the nightmare landscape of trench warfare, gas sentinels were both watchmen and sacrificial shields. Number 9. Balloon observer. Balloon observers were among the most vulnerable figures on the battlefield. Their job was to ascend in tethered balloons, sometimes hundreds of feet above ground, to observe enemy troop movements and direct artillery fire. From this height, they had a clear view, but so did the enemy. The balloons were enormous, slow-moving targets, easy to spot and even easier to aim at. In World War I, they became a favourite target for enemy pilots, artillery and snipers. The balloons were filled with highly flammable hydrogen, so a single incendiary round could turn the entire structure into a floating fireball. Parachutes were primitive or non-existent in early use, and even when they were issued, jumping out meant risking injury or death. Many observers burned alive or fell to their deaths. Even without direct attacks, being suspended in the air during artillery barrages was psychologically tormenting. You were alone, exposed, and helpless. Communication with the ground could fail, and rapid descents were dangerous. Yet despite the risks, their work was critical to military planning, making them too valuable not to use, and too exposed to survive long. A balloon observer had one of the loneliest and most terrifying seats in military history. Number 10. Japanese Kamicazi pilot. Being a Kamicazi pilot in World War II meant being selected or pressured to die by design. These pilots were trained not to complete a mission and return, but to crash their aircraft directly into enemy ships, turning themselves into guided weapons. While often framed as an honour by Japanese military propaganda, the reality was far darker. Many of these young men were barely out of school, with minimal training and little say in their fate. They were subjected to intense emotional coercion and nationalist indoctrination, made to believe that dying for the emperor was the highest virtue. In truth, they were flying outdated or poorly maintained planes, often loaded with explosives, but with no armour and minimal chance of success. The missions were terrifying. Pilots had to aim their final descent through heavy anti-aircraft fire, often watching friends die before their turn came. There was no ejection seat, no backup plan, and no future. Even writing farewell letters was part of the process. A Kamicazi pilot wasn't expected to win, only to die in a blaze of violent symbolism used by a desperate regime that saw human lives as expendable tools of war. Number 11. Soviet Penal Battalion soldier. In the Red Army during World War II, soldiers who were accused of cowardice, disobedience, or simply unlucky enough to be caught retreating were often reassigned to Strafbats. Penal battalions, these units were essentially death squads made up of disgraced soldiers, sent on the most suicidal missions imaginable. They were forced to clear minefields by walking across them, launch frontal assaults with little or no support, or act as bait to expose enemy positions. Discipline was brutally enforced, sometimes by barrier troops stationed behind them. Soviet soldiers ordered to shoot anyone who tried to retreat. Equipment was minimal, sometimes just rifles without ammunition. Training didn't matter. Survival wasn't expected. The psychological strain was enormous. Already condemned by their own side, they fought without trust, support, or hope. For many, the only way to regain their honour was to survive the impossible and be officially pardoned, a rare outcome. Most were slaughtered within days. Being in a Soviet penal battalion didn't just mean a dangerous job, it meant the state considered you expendable, useful only as a disposable weapon in the bloodiest war of the 20th century. Number 12. Vietkong Tunnel Rat. Tunnel rats were soldiers, often small in stature, assigned to enter the Viet Cong's underground tunnel networks during the Vietnam War. These tunnels were pitch dark, cramped, booby-trapped, and filled with danger at every turn. Tunnel rats had to crawl on hands and knees, sometimes belly first, with only a flashlight and a pistol, never knowing what lay a few feet ahead. The air was foul and humid, and ventilation was nearly non-existent. Inside, they could encounter mines, punji sticks, venomous snakes, or hidden enemies lying in wait. A single misstep could trigger a trap or detonate an explosive. There was no room to turn around, no line of retreat, and no support if something went wrong. Even the silence was terrifying. Each breath echoed like a countdown. The psychological pressure was immense. Absolute isolation in a confined space where death was silent and sudden. Despite their vital role in uncovering supply caches and disrupting enemy operations, tunnel rats operated in the most claustrophobic, terrifying environment. They fought underground, face to face, in total darkness. War, stripped down to its most personal and horrifying form. Number 13. Minefield Clearer. Few military jobs are as nerve-wracking and unforgiving as clearing a minefield. From World War II to modern conflicts, minefield clearers have been tasked with finding and disarming explosive devices, often with little more than a stick, metal detector, or their own boots. In many cases, especially in early wars, soldiers were ordered to cross suspected minefields without proper tools, using their feet to probe the ground. One wrong step could mean instant death or the loss of limbs. Even with modern equipment, the risk remains extreme. Mines are deliberately hidden, sometimes made of plastic to avoid detection, and often laid in patterns designed to trick or trap. Explosives might be decades old, unstable, or rigged with secondary triggers. Clearing them is slow, mentally exhausting work requiring absolute focus for hours at a time. Beyond the immediate danger, the psychological toll is enormous. Every movement becomes a gamble. Every inch forward could be your last. For many, the work doesn't end when the war does. Minefield clearers are still active in former war zones today, long after the fighting has stopped. It's a job where a single moment of distraction can cost you everything. Number 14. Explosive Ordnance Disposal Tech. EOD technicians have one of the most mentally and physically demanding jobs in modern warfare. Their task: locate, defuse or destroy improvised explosive devices, mines and unexploded bombs, often hidden in roads, cars or buildings. Even with advanced protective suits and robotic tools, the job is terrifying. Many bombs are designed specifically to kill EOD teams with traps, false wires or delayed triggers. The work requires absolute concentration, steady hands and nerves of steel. One wrong move, one misjudged wire, and the technician can be killed instantly, or worse, survive with devastating injuries. In places like Iraq and Afghanistan, EOD teams worked daily under extreme pressure, sometimes disarming multiple explosive devices in a single mission. The psychological burden was crushing. Every task could be your last, and there was no margin for error. They weren't just risking their own lives, they were the thin line protecting everyone else. Number 15. Human Wave Attacker. During the Iran-Iraq War, one of the most tragic and brutal tactics used by Iran involved sending massive waves of poorly trained volunteers, many of them teenagers, across minefields and toward fortified enemy positions. These human wave attackers often had no weapons, no training, and no real chance of survival. Their role was not to win in combat, but to absorb fire, detonate mines, and overwhelm defences through sheer numbers. Some were even given plastic keys symbolising entry to paradise after death. Survivors described it as mass slaughter. Machine guns cutting down entire lines, artillery blowing apart ranks of unarmed youths. It was state-sanctioned sacrifice, using patriotic fervour and religious zeal to pressure boys into marching to their deaths. These attackers weren't soldiers, they were tools, knowingly sent into the grinder of modern war. Number 16. Powder Monkey. In naval battles during the Age of Sail, powder monkeys were often boys as young as 10 or 12, tasked with running gunpowder from the ship's hold to the cannons during combat. They had to move quickly through dark, smoke-filled corridors, carrying flammable powder next to live cannon fire, explosions, and flying debris. If they tripped, were hit, or dropped their cargo, the results could be catastrophic, not just for them, but for everyone nearby. The work was exhausting, terrifying, and relentless. These children were often targeted by enemy snipers looking to cripple a ship's firepower. There was nowhere to hide, and no one to protect them. It was one of the most dangerous jobs aboard a warship, and one of the most heartbreaking. They were small, expendable, and crucial to keeping the guns firing. Number 17. Galley Slave. Few military roles were as dehumanizing and brutal as that of the galley slave. These men, often prisoners of war, criminals, or enslaved individuals, were chained to the oars of large warships and forced to row for hours or even days without rest. There was no glory, no combat, no strategy, only endless labour. In battle, galley slaves couldn't flee or fight. If the ship caught fire or was rammed, they died chained to their benches. Beatings were routine, food was minimal, and disease spread quickly in the filthy, airless lower decks. They rode through storms, battles and exhaustion, punished for slowing down and left to rot if they grew too weak. Unlike sailors or soldiers, galley slaves had no hope of reward or freedom. They were muscle, nothing more, treated as living engines to power warships. And when they died, they were simply replaced. No role better embodied the cruelty of naval warfare in the pre-modern world. Bonus number 18. Forlorn Hope Assault Trooper. The term Forlorn Hope referred to small units of soldiers chosen to lead near suicidal attacks, often the first wave in storming a breach in a fortress wall or charging into a heavily defended position. These missions were so deadly that volunteers were promised promotions or honours if they somehow survived, but most never did. Leading a forlorn hope meant facing concentrated fire, traps and close combat at point-blank range, with almost no support. The enemy knew you were coming and prepared for your exact path. Soldiers selected for these roles were usually unmarried men or prisoners offered a chance at redemption through blood. The psychological pressure was immense. Many wrote farewell letters before the charge, fully expecting to die. Even within their own armies, they were seen as expendable tools to test or soften enemy defences. Glory was promised, but rarely earned. Being part of a forlorn hope wasn't about courage alone. It was about accepting death for the slightest chance that someone behind you might live long enough to win the day.